President, pursuant to Section 601B of the International Security Assistance and Arms Control Act, I move to discharge the Committee on Foreign Relations from the further consideration of Senate Joint Resolution 90 to direct the President to terminate the use of United States Armed Forces for hostilities within or against Venezuela unless specifically authorized by a declaration of war or specific authorization for use of military force.
The clerk will report.
Motion to discharge S.J. Res. 90 to direct the removal of the United States Armed Forces from hostilities within or against Venezuela that have not been authorized by Congress.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I will begin, I think, a few hours of floor speeches on Senate Joint Resolution 90, and I appreciate the work of Leader Thune and Leader Schumer in scheduling this matter for a vote today at 5 o'clock. I view it as a very important one. The act that I just read, the International Security Assistance and Arms Control Export Act, is an act that allows a single senator to file a privileged motion that can be heard on the floor of the Senate without intervening committee action under a simple majority threshold to address the most serious question that this body ever has to grapple with, question of war. The War Powers Act was passed in 1974, and it has a set of provisions in it. Those provisions include presidential notification of Congress when there are military actions undertaken that meet the definition of hostilities within the act. And the President has notified us, President Trump, like other presidents, has provided notice of military actions. And the particular statute allows this motion to be heard on the floor in a privileged status if two threshold questions are met. First, that there is no congressional authorization covering a proposed military action. And second, that military action is either ongoing or imminent, such that the motion should be heard. The framers in 1974 of this act clearly intended that Congress should be able to have a vote and debate on this matter even before the initiation of war, so that Congress could be in a position to stop it before it begins. And so what I am offering, Mr. President, together with my co-sponsors, Senators Schiff and Paul, is this resolution to try to make plain what the Constitution makes plain, and that is no war without Congress. We should not be in a war without Congress. I have had the opportunity, Mr. President, as have had some of my colleagues, to go into the classified facility here in the Senate and review the legal authorization document that the Trump administration has presented recently to the Senate concerning the military strikes against boats in the Caribbean and Pacific. Now, I reviewed that in the SCIF, so I can't talk about the content of it. I would encourage all of my colleagues to go review it, because I basically believe there are three critical errors in that. One, a mistaken philosophy of executive war powers that derives from a misquotation of constitutional era documents that the framers were using as they grappled with the war powers questions. Two, a domestic legal rationale for when the president can unilaterally wage war that is completely contrary to the Constitution. And three, an international legal rationale that I think most of the members of this body would find to be quite a stretch if they review it. But the one thing, Mr. President, I can say is something that isn't in the document, and so I'm not in any danger of revealing classified information. What's not in the document that is available for senators to review is any legal rationale that would suggest that United States military action against the sovereign nation of Venezuela or any sovereign nation is covered by the legal rationale in that document. And just this morning, there has been public press suggesting that even the president recognizes that there is no legal rationale for such military action, again, absent congressional authorization. Why are we bringing this to the floor, Mr. President? We're bringing it to the floor because of a set of actions we've already discussed in a resolution that was filed by my colleague, Senator Schiff, a couple weeks back, where we had a vote the increased pace of military operations in the Caribbean and the Pacific near Venezuela. And the justification that the White House has used for those often references Venezuela. So there's an ongoing and increasing pace of strikes against boats that are killing dozens of individuals. But with respect to additional actions that are specifically focused on Venezuela, that enable this resolution to meet the imminence test under the War Powers Resolution, on October 15, 2025, President Trump confirms that he has authorized the CIA to conduct covert action in Venezuela. Now, it's highly unusual for a president to publicly announce that he's authorized covert action. It almost immediately makes it non-covert once the president has announced it. But that has been widely, publicly disseminated, that the president has authorized covert action in Venezuela. The next day, October 16, the president says, "We are certainly looking at land now," signifying a land invasion of Venezuela. On October 24, there were multiple public reports, and this is underway, that the Pentagon has sent the Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group to U.S. Southcom to be positioned in and around Venezuela. You don't need a Ford-class carrier to interdict small drug boats. That's not what you use a carrier for. That direction of the Ford, which includes many Virginians who are positioned on the Ford, to Southcom is specifically to have it there, a raid nearby Venezuela in the event the president decides to start a war there. And then finally, on October 31, public reporting showed that many Trump administration officials have told the press that a secret list of targets in Venezuela has been drawn up. All of this together with the increased pace of strikes in the Caribbean and the Pacific suggests that we are on the verge of something that should not happen without a debate and vote in Congress before the American people. This is an indication, Mr. President, of the current assets that are massed around Venezuela. The U.S. ships and aircraft massing off Venezuela, and this comes from a Washington Post report of November 1, 2025. The Gerald R. Ford, the largest and most modern aircraft carrier in the world, built at the Newport News shipyard in Virginia, is the lead, but the mass of other ships and submarines and special operations vehicles and aircraft platforms, both manned and unmanned, is significant. Currently, about 10% of the United States Navy is arrayed around Venezuela. They've been pulled from every other theater in the world to array around Venezuela. And this poses some significant risks to U.S. sailors. Venezuela has very high-end weaponry that they have acquired from U.S. adversaries, primarily Russia and Iran, that could do significant damage to these U.S. assets and to our sailors and troops that are on these assets. Particularly if Venezuela were to misread the impressions or the strategy of the United States, or there were to be some kind of a miscommunication, it would not at all be outside of historical precedent for Venezuela to use its own weapons if it believed it was subject to imminent attack, and that would pose the U.S. troops connected to these multiple platforms to significant danger. And that is what we should avoid. Mr. President, here is my belief. There may be members in this body who believe that we should be at war with Venezuela, just as there may be members in this body who believe we should be at war with narco-traffickers in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And there is a simple solution for that that is consistent with the Constitution. And that solution is for U.S. senators to draft up an authorization for use of military force and have the backbone to put their own names on it if they believe a war is a good idea. But the framers of the Constitution firmly believed that we should not be at war. We should not be risking our troops who are on all these platforms right now, their life and their health. We should not be risking them without a debate and a vote in Congress. The framers took this position in such an unusual way in 1787. In all of the other countries around the world, the ones they were familiar with, the initiation of war was a matter for the executive. But the framers of the Constitution, as I've said before, even with George Washington as the president, a great military leader who they revered, they said a decision about war is too important to put in the hands of one person. And thus, the initiation of war should be for the Article I legislative branch, not the Article II executive branch. And that has been consistent constitutional language that is very unique. Most nations still put the decisions about war in the hands of the executive, not the legislative branch. And I've been a stickler about this, whether the president has been a Democrat or Republican. Interestingly enough, Mr. President, this issue came up yesterday right across the street in the Supreme Court as the court was hearing oral arguments on the case of Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump, a case dealing with the question of whether tariffs could be imposed under the IEEPA statute that we've spent some time discussing on the floor. The Solicitor General of the United States, Attorney Sauer, is not only the nation's chief advocate before the Supreme Court, he was Donald Trump's personal lawyer. This is an individual who is very close to the president, both personally and now in the professional capacity. And he was making the argument that Congress had delegated a clear congressional power, the power to impose tariffs, the power to tax, to the executive. And one of the justices, Donald Trump's appointee, Justice Gorsuch, was pressing on the question of whether Congress really can delegate specific congressional powers to the executive or not. On page 68 of the transcript of the oral argument in that case, Justice Gorsuch was pressing this Solicitor General, Donald Trump's personal attorney. What's the reason to accept the notion that Congress can hand off the power to declare war to the president? And the Solicitor General said, well, we don't contend that. Again, that would be an abdication, not a delegation. I stand here, Mr. President, to urge my colleagues, and I've done this often during my 12 and a half years in the Senate, not to abdicate. Don't abdicate the power to declare war. Of all the powers given to the Article I branch, this is the one that should be most jealously guarded. The reason the framers put this decision in the hands of Congress was because of a belief that we should not risk the lives of our service members unless there is a clear political consensus, as expressed by a vote in Congress, that the mission is worth it. If Congress is not willing to have a debate and say that the mission is worth it, then it's the height of, I would sort of call it public immorality, to nevertheless require people who are serving to risk their lives and their health. Now, people who volunteer for the military volunteer knowing that it's going to be dangerous. They do sign up for that. But they ought to know if they are ordered into a mission that involves military action, that there's a political consensus by the elected leadership of the country that that mission is worth it. And absent a debate and vote in Congress, we are ordering people to potentially risk their lives without having the courage ourselves to sign our name to that mission. And so I stand here with my co-sponsors, Senator Schiff and Senator Paul, to say we shouldn't be at war without Congress. Even President Trump, by public reporting today, suggests that he may not yet think he has a legal rationale for a war against Venezuela. Let's not abdicate. Let's not abdicate the most important power that we have. I would hope that all my colleagues, whatever they think about the virtues or vices of a war against Venezuela, would at least stand strong for the proposition that Congress should have the power and indeed the responsibility to have a debate and have a vote on it before we order our troops to risk their lives. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.